The night was colder than usual. Streetlights flickered weakly, throwing patches of pale yellow on the wet pavement. Cars rushed past, their headlights slicing through the dark, but none slowed down. The city was alive, yet in its noise and chaos, one figure moved unnoticed. A young woman walked with her head bent low. In her hands, she clutched a small plastic container, holding it close to her chest as though it were the most valuable thing in the world. To everyone else, it was nothing more than leftovers, scraps from a diner shift. But to her, it meant dinner for her younger brother, the only family she had left. Her coat was too thin for the biting wind. Her shoes were worn, the soles almost gone. Every step looked heavy, but she kept going. She couldn't stop, not when someone was waiting for her. Her name was Emily. She was only 21, but if you looked into her eyes, you'd think she was older. Life had carved its struggles onto her face. Once, she had been a college student with bright dreams, and a future painted with books, laughter, and hope. But fate had been cruel. Her mother passed away, and her father abandoned them soon after. Overnight, she became more than a sister. She became a mother to her 13-year-old brother. From that moment, her dreams were folded away, buried under the weight of survival. Every day she worked at a diner, cleaning tables, scrubbing floors, begging for extra shifts. Wages were small, tips even smaller. She never complained. Whatever she earned, she saved. Whatever food was left, she carried home in containers like the one pressed to her chest tonight. The city around her sparkled with neon signs, with people laughing as they exited warm restaurants, with taxis honking impatiently at one another. Yet Emily walked invisible, a shadow among lights. No one stopped to ask where she was going. No one cared. But what Emily didn't know, what she could never imagine, was that tonight was different. Tonight someone was watching, someone who would see her not as a shadow but as a soul. And that single moment of recognition would change everything. Because sometimes stories don't begin with dreams. Sometimes they begin with leftovers clutched in tired hands. Emily's life hadn't always been this way. There was a time, not long ago, when her world looked different. A small dorm room, books stacked on her desk, notes scribbled in the margins of a well-worn journal. She had been a college student, chasing dreams of becoming a teacher. Her laughter used to echo through hallways. Her eyes used to shine with hope. She believed in tomorrow, but tomorrow didn't keep its promise. Her mother's sudden illness had shaken the very foundation of her world. Hospitals, medications, sleepless nights. The battle was long and the ending was merciless. When her mother passed away, Emily felt her heart split open. She thought at least her father would stay strong for them. Instead, grief swallowed him whole, and within weeks he walked out of their lives, leaving behind nothing but silence and unpaid bills. Emily was just 20, but overnight she became more than just herself. She became guardian, provider, protector, all for her 13-year-old brother. His name was Daniel, a boy with sharp eyes and a quiet smile. He was still a child who deserved innocence, but Emily knew the world wouldn't wait for them. Someone had to keep the lights on, put food on the table, pay the rent, and that someone was her, so dreams were folded away. College books that once meant possibility were now stacked in a corner, gathering dust. The future that had once been bright now shrank into a single question: how will we survive tomorrow? The diner became her lifeline. Morning to night, she worked shifts no one else wanted. She wiped tables, swept floors, carried trays heavier than her tired arms could bear. Customers came and went, leaving behind crumpled napkins and half-eaten meals. Sometimes they left tips, small coins she tucked carefully into her pocket. Sometimes they didn't even look at her face. Every night when her shift ended, she would gather leftovers into plastic containers. Cold fries, uneaten pie, scraps of chicken, things most people tossed away without thought. For Emily, they weren't scraps. They were survival. She carried them home with care, as though protecting treasure. At the edge of town, where the streetlights ended and the roads grew silent, she returned to what they called home. It wasn't a home at all, just a broken shelter pieced together with cardboard, old blankets, and rusted sheets of metal. Daniel would be waiting there, his eyes lighting up at the sight of the container in her hands. He never asked what she had to do to get it. He only smiled, grateful, and ate quickly, hunger erasing any pretense of patience. Emily would sit beside him, pulling her thin coat tighter, pretending she wasn't cold, pretending she wasn't hungry. Most nights she let him eat first, telling him she'd already had dinner at work. It was a lie she repeated so often it almost felt true. She never let Daniel see her cry. At night, when he was asleep, she would bury her face in her hands and let the tears come. Silent sobs in the dark. Grief for her mother, anger at her father, fear for the future. And yet, every morning she rose again, because she had no choice. Still, beneath the weight of exhaustion, a quiet strength lived in her. She refused to beg. She refused to give up. Pride was her armor, love was her fuel, and survival was her only goal. But what Emily never knew was that fate was moving closer. That her tired steps, her invisible suffering, were about to collide with someone from a world completely different from hers. Someone who would see her not as a servant in a diner, not as a shadow on the street, but as a soul worth saving. Across town, in a different part of the same city, a car rolled silently through dimly lit streets. It was a luxury sedan, polished, powerful, commanding presence even in the quiet of the night. Inside, a man sat behind the wheel, Richard. To the outside world, Richard was everything people aspired to be. A CEO of a successful company, wealthy, respected, and admired in business circles. His reputation was of a man who lived with precision, discipline, and control. But inside that polished armor, Richard carried wounds that no wealth could heal. His wife had passed away years ago, taken by an illness that came too soon and too suddenly. Since then, he had raised his only son, Michael, alone. The world saw him as strong, but he knew the truth. Every day was a quiet struggle. Success in boardrooms meant little when his house echoed with absence. Michael sat in the passenger seat, his forehead pressed gently against the cold glass of the window. At just 10 years old, he was thoughtful beyond his years. Where other children saw only games, Michael noticed details, the small things most people ignored. His heart carried a gentleness his father sometimes envied, a softness Richard worried he himself lacked. The city flashed by outside, glowing signs, dark alleys, restless crowds. Richard's mind was elsewhere, circling around a late meeting, an upcoming deal, the endless weight of decisions. He drove in silence, lost in thought, until a small voice cut through the quiet. "Daddy." Richard glanced sideways. "Yes, Michael?" The boy's eyes were fixed outside, his voice urgent but soft. "It's her." Richard slowed the car instinctively, though he didn't yet understand. "Who?" he asked. "The girl," Michael whispered, pressing closer to the glass. "The one I told you about?" "From the diner." "That's her." Richard frowned, his memory stirring. Michael had mentioned a girl once, a waitress who had shown him kindness. He had gone to the diner with a friend, hadn't had enough money for pie, and she had quietly paid the difference from her own tips. Richard had dismissed it at the time, brushing it off as a small act, nothing worth lingering on. But to Michael it had mattered. And now, as Richard followed his son's gaze, he saw her. A young woman walking down the street with her head lowered, clutching a small container tightly to her chest. Her pace was slow, her shoulders hunched against the cold. The thin coat wrapped around her seemed almost useless against the biting wind. "She looks fragile," Michael whispered, almost to himself, then more firmly. "That's her, Daddy, I'm sure of it." Richard's hands tightened on the wheel. Something about the scene stirred discomfort in him. Not the calculated kind of decision he was used to, but something instinctive, almost irrational. He slowed the car further, his eyes following the girl as she turned down a narrow alley. The container in her hands looked so small, yet the way she held it, as though it carried more value than gold. For a man like Richard, decisions usually came with data, analysis, logic. He built companies on numbers, strategies, and risk calculations, but this moment had none of that. It was raw, human. A stranger in the night walking into shadows with nothing but scraps of food. Michael leaned forward, his small hand resting on his father's arm. His voice trembled, but not with fear, with urgency. "Daddy, please, stop. We can't just drive away." Richard hesitated. Years of caution, of living behind walls of discipline and detachment, battled inside him. This was not his world. He was not used to stepping into the lives of strangers. Charity, he thought, was for organizations, for donations written on checks, not for alleys in the middle of the night. And yet he could not shake the echo of his late wife's words spoken long ago. Wealth means nothing if it never touches another soul. He pulled the car over. The engine's low hum faded as he opened the door. Michael immediately followed, clutching his father's coat with one hand. Together they stepped into the cold night air. The alley was dim, littered with broken fences and discarded trash. Shadows stretched across the walls, swallowing sound. At the far end, Richard saw her, the girl his son had recognized. She had stopped walking. She was kneeling beside a makeshift shelter of cardboard and old blankets, pressed tightly against a broken fence. A boy, barely 13, emerged from the shadows. His eyes lit up at the sight of the container. He snatched it eagerly, hunger too raw to be hidden. Emily, for Richard didn't yet know her name, smiled faintly at him. Exhaustion carved into her face and pulled her thin coat tighter. Richard froze. The sight struck him like a blow. He had expected hardship, perhaps even poverty. But not this. Not two children surviving in silence, invisible to the world. Beside him, Michael's voice broke the silence again. Soft, insistent, piercing, "Daddy, we have to help her." And in that single plea, Richard felt the clash between instinct and caution collapse. He realized he was no longer just a CEO, no longer just a man of discipline. In that moment, he was a father standing beside his son, being asked to do something human. Richard had seen poverty before, in reports and headlines, in stories shared at charity galas where men in expensive suits clinked glasses and nodded solemnly. But seeing it unfold in front of him, raw and unfiltered, was different. This wasn't a statistic or a story on a page. It was a young woman and a child, surviving in silence while the city rushed past them, blind. He watched as the boy tore open the container, devouring food with the desperation of someone who hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. The girl and Emily didn't touch the food. She only watched him, her tired eyes softening into the faintest smile as if his hunger satisfied was enough to keep her alive. Richard's breath caught. Something inside him cracked. Michael tugged his father's sleeve again. "Daddy," he whispered, his voice trembling. "She's not okay. We have to do something." Richard hesitated. His instincts screamed caution. This wasn't his world. He was a man of contracts, of boardrooms, of carefully measured risks. Every move he made was calculated. Every decision weighed against outcomes. But what was the outcome here? What was the risk? That he might feel something? That he might care? For a moment, he almost turned away. But then Emily pulled her coat tighter, curling around her brother protectively, and Richard saw something that stopped him cold. It was the same expression his late wife used to wear when she cradled Michael as a baby. That mix of exhaustion, fierce love, and an unspoken vow. No matter what happens, I will protect you. It was then he realized this wasn't about pity. This was about survival. About dignity. About a young woman who had taken the blows of life and still stood between her brother and the world, even if it broke her in the process. Richard stepped forward. His footsteps echoed in the quiet alley. Emily's head snapped up instantly, her body tense, her arm moving protectively in front of her brother. Her eyes, sharp despite their weariness, locked onto him with a mix of fear and defiance. "Stay back," she said quickly, her voice low but firm. Richard stopped, raising his hands slightly. He wasn't used to being challenged. In his world, people bowed to his presence, listened when he spoke. But here, none of that mattered. He was just a stranger in an expensive coat, intruding on a fragile world. Michael slipped out from behind his father and stepped closer, his small frame unthreatening, his eyes filled with recognition. "It's okay," he said softly to Emily. "I know you. From the diner. You gave me pie, remember? When I didn't have enough money?" Emily's expression flickered, surprise breaking through her guardedness. She remembered, the boy with kind eyes, embarrassed but grateful when she'd quietly covered his bill. She hadn't thought of it since. For her, it had been a small act of kindness. For him, clearly, it had been much more. Richard cleared his throat, his voice steady but gentler than he realized it could be. "You helped my son once, now. Let me help you." Emily shook her head almost violently. "No," she said, pride burning in her chest. "We don't need pity. We're fine." "Fine." Richard's eyes swept over the cardboard shelter, the thin blanket, the boy still eating hungrily from scraps. The word felt like a cruel joke, but he didn't argue. He knew pride was the only armor she had left, and stripping it from her would be the cruelest thing he could do. Michael, however, didn't understand pride or defense. He only saw what was in front of him. Slowly, he crouched down and held out his hand to Emily's brother. The boy paused, looking at his sister for guidance. Emily hesitated, but the innocence in Michael's gesture was disarming. Her brother reached out, their small hands clasping in a quiet moment of understanding. Something passed between them, something pure, untouched by the hardness of the world. Two children connecting in a way that adults often forgot how to. Emily's eyes softened, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of years suddenly pressed down on her all at once. She realized then that sometimes accepting help wasn't weakness. Sometimes it was also an act of strength. Richard saw it too. He didn't speak further that night. He simply crouched down to their level, his eyes meeting Emily's. In them, he didn't offer pity. He offered recognition, the kind that said, "I see you. I see your fight, and I will stand with you." For a long moment, the alley was silent. Just four souls breathing in the cold night air. The city beyond them still rushing, still blind. But in that small corner of the world, something shifted. Michael's voice broke the quiet once more. The same words that had started it all. "Daddy, it's her." And this time, Richard understood exactly what his son meant. For a long moment, silence hung in the alley. Only the distant hum of traffic and the shuffle of the boy finishing his meal broke the stillness. Richard knelt down, eye level with Emily, but he didn't know what to say next. Words had always come easily in boardrooms where every sentence was measured, calculated, sharpened into strategy. Here, however, language felt heavy. How do you speak to someone who has lost almost everything? How do you step into a life so different from your own without sounding like a stranger offering pity? Emily's arms tightened protectively around her brother. Her body was rigid, her jaw set. She had spent too long building walls to let them crumble so easily. Not even in front of a well-dressed man with kind eyes. Pride was all she had left. Pride and the fierce need to shield the boy beside her from more disappointment. "You should go," she said finally, her voice flat but trembling underneath. "We don't need your charity. We've managed this long. We'll be fine." The word "fine" cut into Richard like glass. He glanced around again at the thin blankets, the cardboard pressed against the fence, the empty eyes of a child too young to carry so much hunger. This is not fine, he thought. But he didn't argue. He could see it in her face, argue, and she'd shut down completely. Michael took a small step closer, crouching near Daniel. The younger boy looked at him with suspicion at first, but Michael's smile was gentle, without judgment. "You don't have to be alone," he said quietly. "Sometimes, it's okay to let someone help." Emily's eyes darted to Michael. Something in his voice, in the innocence of it, pierced the defenses she had so carefully built. Adults spoke of charity, of pity, of handouts, but children spoke only of truth. And in Michael's truth, there was no insult, no judgment, just an open hand. Richard swallowed hard. His wife's voice echoed in his memory once more. "Wealth means nothing if it never touches another soul." For years he had ignored that wisdom, burying himself in work, in numbers, in distractions. But here in this alley, looking at this young woman and her brother, he finally understood what she had meant. "I'm not here to give you charity," Richard said slowly, choosing his words with care. "You helped my son once when you didn't have to. Now let me repay that kindness. That's all this is, not pity, not charity, just repayment." Emily's lips pressed into a thin line. She wanted to argue, to push him away, to say no. But her brother, Daniel, looked up at her with hopeful eyes. For him, even the smallest chance of warmth, of safety, of something better was a miracle. How many nights had she seen that longing in his face and been powerless to answer it? Still, pride burned inside her. She had endured humiliation, exhaustion, endless struggle. To accept help now felt like surrender. And yet deep down she knew survival wasn't about pride. Survival was about choosing what kept them alive. Richard didn't push further. Instead, he pulled off his coat, an expensive black wool coat, heavy and warm, and held it out. "Here," he said simply. "It's cold tonight. Take this for your brother." Emily stiffened. "No." But Daniel's eyes locked onto the coat, the warmth it promised. His thin shoulders trembled in the wind. Emily's chest tightened painfully. She wanted to scream, to cry, to run. Instead, she shook her head again, clutching him tighter. Richard didn't force the coat into her hands. He simply draped it gently across the cardboard beside them. "It's not a gift," he said softly. "It's a loan. Keep it until you don't need it anymore. Then return it to me." Those words slipped past her defenses. Alone, not charity, not pity. Alone meant dignity. It meant trust. Slowly, Emily's breath shuddered, her eyes filling with tears she tried desperately to hide. Daniel, unable to resist, reached out and pulled the coat around his shoulders. The relief on his face was instant. For the first time in days, he looked like a child again, safe and warm if only for a moment. Emily's throat tightened. Pride or no pride, she could not deny him this comfort. Her defenses cracked, and in that crack a sliver of hope slipped through. Richard saw it, the subtle shift, the way her eyes softened though her lips said nothing. He knew this wasn't victory. This was trust being tested, and he would have to earn it carefully, slowly. Michael, meanwhile, was still crouched by Daniel. "My mom used to say," he whispered, "that when someone helps you, it doesn't mean you're weak. It just means they care." Emily blinked hard. Michael's words struck her deeper than Richard's had, because they carried the unshakable honesty of a child. She looked at the boy, then at his father. For the first time, she saw not strangers in fine clothes, but people. One grieving, one innocent, both reaching out without strings attached. The walls inside her shook. She still wanted to say no. But in her heart, she already knew she couldn't. Not for herself. For Daniel. For his chance at something better. Richard stood, straightening his posture, but his tone remained quiet. "I can help you," he said. "Safe housing, a job. School for your brother. Not handouts and opportunities. You won't owe me anything. You'll just have a chance to breathe again." Emily froze. The word sounded impossible, almost unreal. A job? Housing? School? She wanted to believe, but she had been disappointed too many times. Empty promises had no place in her world. "I don't trust people like you," she whispered finally, her voice breaking. Richard didn't flinch. "That's fair," he admitted. "But you can trust him." He gestured toward Michael, who now sat shoulder to shoulder with Daniel. The two boys exchanging shy, curious smiles. Emily looked at them. Two children from different worlds finding common ground in a way adults so often failed to. And in that image, something inside her broke wide open. She realized that sometimes strength wasn't in refusing help. Sometimes strength was in accepting it, for the sake of someone you love. Her tears spilled silently down her cheeks as she nodded once, barely perceptible. Richard exhaled slowly, relief washing over him. It wasn't consent, not fully, but it was enough. Enough to begin. Enough to take the first step towards something neither of them could yet imagine. In that dark alley, with the city rushing blindly beyond, a decision was made. Not spoken aloud, but felt deep in the soul. A decision that would reshape not only Emily's life, but Richard's as well. And it had all begun with a boy's soft voice saying, "Daddy." It's her. The days that followed were unlike anything Emily had ever known. For years, her routine had been a cycle of exhaustion, diner shifts, collecting scraps, dragging her tired body back to a broken shelter where cold winds cut through thin blankets. But now, for the first time, something shifted. Richard's decision that night hadn't been empty words. It became action. Within days, Emily and Daniel found themselves stepping into a modest but safe apartment Richard had arranged. It wasn't large or luxurious, but compared to the cardboard walls they once called home, it felt like a palace. There was a small kitchen, a bathroom with running water, and two beds with sheets that smelled of laundry soap. Daniel touched everything with wide eyes. The light switch, the faucet, the soft pillow beneath his cheek. For the first time in years, his laughter filled a room. Emily, however, struggled to relax. She stood in the corner, her hands clasped tightly as though waiting for someone to tell her it was a mistake, that it could all vanish in an instant. She whispered to herself, "Don't get used to this. Don't believe too easily." Yet when she saw Daniel sleeping soundly that night, wrapped in warmth, she allowed herself to breathe. Just a little. Richard kept his word. He enrolled Daniel back into school, placing books in his hands instead of plastic containers of leftovers. The boy who once spent evenings shivering now walked to class with a backpack, pencils, and a timid but growing smile. When his teacher asked him what he wanted to be one day, Daniel whispered, "An engineer." A dream he had never dared to voice aloud before. Emily, too, was given something she thought she'd lost forever: dignity through work. Richard offered her a position in his company's cafeteria. It wasn't charity. It wasn't a handout. It was a job with stable pay, regular hours, and the chance to stand on her own feet again. At first she hesitated. Every instinct in her screamed that she was a burden, that she owed too much already. But Richard had been careful with his words. It's not about owing me. It's about building for yourself. So she put on the uniform, tied back her hair, and stepped into the kitchen. At first her hands trembled, and not from lack of skill, but from disbelief. She was no longer carrying scraps in plastic boxes. She was serving meals with dignity, handing trays across counters, being thanked instead of ignored. Every small gesture reminded her she wasn't invisible anymore. Still, the journey wasn't easy. Emily carried years of scars, both visible and hidden. At night, when Daniel slept peacefully, she often sat by the window of their new apartment and cried quietly. She cried for the mother she had lost, for the father who had abandoned her, for the dreams she had buried under endless struggle. She cried because a part of her feared it could all collapse, that she might wake up one day back in the cold alley, clutching scraps once again. But then she would think of Michael. She remembered his innocent voice, his small hand reaching for Daniel's. She remembered the way he had seen her, not as a burden, not as a shadow, but as a person who mattered. That memory steadied her heart. Richard, too, changed in those weeks. At first, he had seen Emily as someone to help, a responsibility his son's kindness had placed on his shoulders. But as time passed, he found himself learning from her resilience. In her eyes, he saw reflections of his own pain, the grief of loss, the weight of responsibility, the courage to keep moving when life had tried to break you. Helping her wasn't just saving her, it was healing him. Slowly, Emily began to believe in possibility again. She started attending evening classes, determined to finish what she had once started before her world had fallen apart. Her hands, once rough from scrubbing floors, now held pens and textbooks. Each word she wrote reminded her she was more than her struggles, more than her scars. Daniel thrived. Each morning he woke with energy, talking about lessons, teachers, and friends. He laughed more easily now, his cheeks fuller, his eyes brighter. For the first time in years, Emily could look at him without guilt pressing down on her chest. One evening, as Emily served food in the cafeteria, she looked up and saw Richard and Michael walking in. Daniel, spotting them, ran across the room, laughing, carefree, his laughter ringing louder than she had ever heard before. Emily paused, a tray in her hands, her eyes welling with tears. Not tears of despair this time, but of gratitude. She had once carried scraps of food in a plastic container, clutched desperately as though it was treasure. Now she carried something far greater, hope. And it had all begun because a little boy had looked out of a car window, recognized kindness when he saw it, and whispered, "Daddy, it's her." Spring arrived quietly, carrying with it the promise of renewal. The air no longer bit with winter's cruelty, and blossoms began to dot the city streets. Life moved forward as it always did. Yet for Emily, every sunrise now carried a different meaning. She stood in the company cafeteria where she now worked, apron tied neatly, hand steady, voice calm as she served food to employees who came and went. To the outside eye, she was just another worker behind the counter. But inside, she knew she was no longer the girl who once walked through icy streets clutching scraps in a plastic container. She was something else now. She was rebuilding. Her brother Daniel thrived with each passing week. His face was fuller, his laughter brighter. He came home from school with books under his arms, excited stories on his lips, and a dream in his heart that grew louder each day. "I want to build things one day. I want to be an engineer." Emily listened to him, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel the sting of guilt when he spoke about the future. Instead, she felt pride, relief, a quiet, burning gratitude. Richard often visited the cafeteria with Michael. Their presence had become familiar, comforting, even grounding. Emily noticed how Richard softened around his son, how Michael's innocence anchored his father in ways no boardroom ever could. She also noticed how Richard looked at her, not with pity, not with superiority, but with recognition. They were two people carrying different burdens, both scarred by loss, both learning to heal in unexpected ways. That morning, when Daniel spotted them across the room, he broke into a run. His laughter echoed carefree and light as he threw himself into Michael's arms. The two boys laughed together, one once starved, the other once lonely, now inseparable in their own small world of friendship. Emily paused mid-step, her tray balanced in her hands, her chest tightening. Tears welled in her eyes, but not from sorrow. These were tears of gratitude, of transformation. She had carried scraps once, scraps that felt heavier than gold. Now she carried hope. And all of it had begun because a small boy had looked out of a car window, seen her for who she was, and whispered, "Daddy, it's her." Life doesn't always give second chances. For many, the cold nights stretch endlessly. The hunger never quiets and the world never stops to notice. But sometimes, in rare moments, one act of compassion can become the thread that stitches broken lives back together. Emily never forgot the hunger. She never forgot the freezing nights under cardboard walls, or the despair of wondering if tomorrow would ever come. But she also never forgot the voice that pierced through the silence of the city. The voice of a child who recognized kindness and demanded the world answer it. And now, the story turns to you, the one watching, the one listening. How many Emilys walk past us every single day unseen in the rush of our lives? How many children like Daniel go to sleep hungry, their dreams buried under the weight of survival? How many moments of kindness slip away unnoticed when all it takes is one to change everything? Michael was only 10, yet he saw what others ignored. If a child can recognize humanity in the shadows, then why can't we? So the question remains, the next time you see someone carrying their world in tired hands, will you look away? Or will you stop and whisper to yourself, "It's her. It's him. It's them." Because sometimes seeing is the first step to saving.